When I first began to consider the problem of mood in architecture, I was interested in how an architect like Richard Neutra thought not about the semantic character of his buildings, as architects of the 18th century did, but rather how he considered how his designs shaped the feeling states and moods of the human beings who occupied them. This shift from a preoccupation with buildings, public buildings, to private space, and the mood of humans therein, was part of a broad psychologizing of domestic space. As the specifically psychoanalytic version of this psychologizing began to pervade the domestic interior, as architects like Neutra Americanized this Viennese scene, the language of analysis began also to be replaced by more spatially driven forms of therapeutics, in which mood and vibration from things like the orgone box took precedence over discourse. As I have been working at home, watching others at home seeking to manage the anxiety of this world pandemic, economic collapse, and the violence of structural racism, a world made more dangerous by the fast and free flow of false information, a word in a scramble because not enough thinking has been done about spatial zoonosis, it is impossible not to see the limits of what previously seemed expansive, like the work of Richard Neutra. How privileged, how white, how narrowly anthropocentric it all seems today. In response, I have become interested in thinking about what new histories are needed and can be told on the basis of old evidence, like looking for animals and what they signify in the work of Neutra, what new ways of writing are necessary, about the value of proceeding more slowly and empirically, and investigating not only who is permitted to live in a home and what their feeling state might be, but what kind of home the discipline of architecture might offer to beings that it previously caged, such as here, or set to work, like Neutra's camel table, or chained to a tree. This is Neutra and his family. In 1956, Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk constructed an elevated platform using lumber, glass, and patterned material that created the illusion of a solid ground plane suddenly disappearing and opening to a chasm below. The apparatus was developed as part of a series of laboratory experiments in what would eventually be called ecological psychology that took place at Cornell University's Behavior Farm. Gibson and Walk's study was designed to test the depth perception of not just human instruments, but animals as well. Somewhat apocryphally, the study is said to have been inspired by Gibson's visit to the Grand Canyon, where she was accompanied by her husband, James Gibson, whose the perception of the visual world and theory of ecological affordance would become highly influential, and they're just learning to crawl children. Eventually published in Scientific American in 1960, Eleanor Gibson's widely read and now historic study featured photographs of human babies and kittens and goats peering over a cantilevered precipice into an abyss, confronting what the authors called the visual cliff. During the 1950s, architectural periodicals were also distributing more and more images of elevated platforms jutting out over disappearing ground and turning the traditional view, once a perspective and later a film strip, into a test of the psychological impact of encountering this visual cliff. Although Gibson considered the environmental trigger for this response specific enough to require that it be artificially fabricated in a lab, to encounter the cliff during the 1950s required, in fact, neither the extreme situation of the Behavior Farm nor the Grand Canyon. Visual cliffs were becoming increasingly ubiquitous, the precondition of an emerging visual ecology of instability. As urbanization intensified after World War II, development began to spread into areas previously considered too precarious to be safe or economically feasible. Precarity was determined by many different local conditions and geographies, but one was steep inclines. Hillside development, in turn, accelerated surface erosion and, particularly in places that relied on septic tanks, multiplied subterranean zones of vulnerability. Under these circumstances, landslides became increasingly common events. In cities like Los Angeles, where the effects of rapid urbanization were amplified both by large numbers of steep canyons and a desert climate typified by cycles of high heat and heavy rain, landscapes became, let's call them, predictable surprises, and the visual cliff, the ground of a new eco-perceptual paradigm in which trees would play a major role. In 1937, a landslide in Los Angeles' Elysian Park created a tourist attraction nicknamed the Moving Mountain. On November 27, over 500,000 spectators came to see the crumbling ground and to eat popcorn, like going to the movies. Richard Neutra's health house, built nearby, was also a hillside spectacle. The first use of a steel frame for a single-family house was triggered by the need to manage a cliff. The construction site attracted a steady stream of visitors, and photographs attest to the degree to which the impact of the exposed steel frame was amplified by the steep and precarious soil on which it rested. While the house was extraordinary in virtually every respect, from the famously idiosyncratic client and generous budget to dramatic site, Neutra would later claim to have anticipated that the peculiar precarity of the level house would eventually become a generic condition. He wrote, "I told myself that mankind, with a population swell in store, would one day run out of level ground. It would have to build on steepness and on prefabricated stilts," end quote. Neutra's remarks were not anticipatory, however, but rather were made in hindsight, because already in 1952, when he made those remarks, the growing ubiquity of landslides had resulted not in repeated and surprise spectacles, but in new and ubiquitous regulations. In that year, the first grading code in the United States embedded geotechnical engineering requirements into both architectural design and construction stages of development. The goal of these regulations was safety, but their cause was widespread insecurity about the ground. Grading regulations quickly combined with others restricting the removal of hillside vegetation and initiated a process that eventually shifted the architectural standing of trees. Instead of columns or stilts for holding structures up and off the ground, trees were redefined as means of holding the ground and architecture together. By the time the visual cliff had become a potentially widespread form of architectural trauma, for example, Neutra was reconfiguring trees into key elements of a psycho-environmental therapeutics. The window had long since been a site of potential crisis in Neutra's view, a lure into the unknown, generating psychic separation and repeating birth trauma. During the 1920s and the 1930s, when he was first exploring the psychological impact of architectural design, the environmental setting of this dynamic was largely symbolic, the house standing in for the womb. By the 1950s, however, when the destabilized ground was just one sign that the environment was developing, as he said, and I quote, "an ominous tendency to slip more and more out of control," trees started to figure for Neutra as operational linchpins holding sky, building, and earth together, and on hillsides functionally pushing back against the ground's propensity to collapse into cliffs. Conflating the representational tradition of repoussoir elements such as trees, used to establish the ground of the picture plane and to push it back into deep space, with the new codes assigned to trees by building codes, Neutra began to place trees into the elbows of buildings crooked by steepness. Often abutted windows and at a different angle to the earth than buildings, reflecting their capacity to adapt to changes in the ground. These trees were measures of and against the consequences of the visual cliff. Arboreal histories have much to offer accounts of modern architecture. Having begun his practical training at Otto Frobel's plant nursery and landscaping firm, and under the tutelage of the German botanist Gustav Amann, Neutra fantasized that his own house was a plant that would, in his words, grow and propagate across LA. This is the site of his house before he built it. When Neutra, and this is the house growing, let's say, across it like a tree. When Neutra made a pictorial alphabet for his eldest son, Neutra drew terrace blocks floating above nothing, but pinned to each other and to the earth by the embracing canopies of umbrella pine trees. On a Christmas visit to the desert in 1938, Neutra drew Washingtonia filifera palm trees, the only species native to the region, in response to the fact that Los Angeles had just been, quote, beautified by the planting of 40,000 imported, let's call them invasive palm tree species. And in 1959, Neutra drew a large tree on a hillside in Iseo in the Italian province of Brescia, not far from the epicenter of the Italian COVID-19 outbreak. In all likelihood, the tree actually existed, an empirically observable being that framed the view of the mountains behind for a visitor, human, arriving from below, but also a member of a vast forest ecosystem. In the drawing, the tree emerges from a flight of stairs that have been cut into inclined ground and pushes up against the buildings that hug the edge of a cliff. The tree simultaneously works to keep the image and the environment together. The drawing was made for Umberto De Martini, a doctor who treated everything from hysteria to cancer and wanted to build a sanatorium at a moment when the distinction between tourism and recuperation were not only converging, but pushing more and more development into places like Iseo. Martini's credentials as a doctor were as shaky as the rest of his character. He was a bigamist, a charlatan, and a gold digger who is said to have married the Countess Mona von Bismarck after her husband, Count Eddie, died while in Martini's care. While driving the sports car she bought him around the island of Capri, another vertiginous environment that had become a tourist destination, the doctor went over a cliff and fell to his death. His wife friends referred to the incident as Martini on the rocks. In 2019, Ben Thorpe Brown made a multimedia installation that explored the role of empathy, a 19th century psychological theory in which one subject absorbs the feelings of another, and its potential reactivization as a mode of psycho-environmental resistance. One part of the installation is a film shot in Neutra's house. There, the mechanical camel meets a new caretaker whose name is Cora, a caretaker, and she is a tortoise. She confronts the visual cliff again and again in the film because for her, how to manage a staircase is like our efforts to manage the coronavirus. She must turn her back on windows again and again once she recognizes that they were not designed with her in mind. But she is also the lone survivor of the ecological zoonotic pandemic, a traumatic experience that leaves Cora not in the mood for vibe, but specifically in the mood for language, which she seeks by turning to Neutra's survival by design, perhaps trying to catch his meaning about who survives design today.